Hello everyone and welcome to PC Retro Tech. So this week's video is a bit of a departure from the normal PC content, so let me explain what happened. I wanted some 5¼ inch floppy disks in my PCs, and so I went and bought this very cheap box with around 100 disks in it. And it's cheap precisely because a lot of the disks that are in this are mangled, and you're not going to get much use out of that. So the others can be formatted and relabeled. But as I went through, I noticed that a lot of these have Commodore 64 games on them, so Boulder Dash 1, 2 and 3, Video Puzzle, Pinball and Arachnoid, just on this disc alone. And I realized it would be a real travesty to format this collection. Well, I've not been keeping up with the Commodore. I am a PC guy myself, and I've never even laid eyes on the physical hardware. So what to do? Well, of course, nowadays you can just go out and purchase a Commodore 64. In a kit, second-hand, very cheap, with, quote, everything you'll need, 100% working. So I didn't need a monitor, of course. I had the Commodore 1084S monitor, which you'll have seen in my video on 16-color games for the IBM CGA adapter. So I only needed the Commodore 64 machine and a floppy drive. So this is the classic Brad bin Commodore 64 design and the very famous Commodore 1541 floppy drive. That's a real hulk of a thing, and I can only imagine it's so large and heavy because it's really fast or something. Yeah, well, we'll see about that a bit later. Of course, this kit also came with a data set, which I can't use because I don't have any cassettes, and a joystick and a manual. So the manual that came with it was in German and very grubby, so I went ahead and replaced it with one from the UK in English in much better condition. And then I noticed that the keyboard is actually a QWERTY keyboard, and at first I thought this was just because that's what all Commodore 64s had. But of course German keyboards are different, and this one actually has a pound sign on it. So I looked on the back of the machine, and lo and behold, it says that this was actually manufactured for the UK. Which is a bit of a surprise given that I did buy it in Germany. The joystick, unfortunately, is just a cheap third-party one. It does have a Commodore mode, but when you press the joystick right, things move left, and vice versa. So it seems to be wired up backwards. I do have another joystick I can try, but I think it's only PC, so I'm probably stuck with this. Also, when I got the machine, I didn't realize it only had an RF cable for a television set in it, which I don't have. So I had to wait a few extra days for a cable to turn up for the monitor. So this is a DIN plug on one end and 3 RCA connectors on the other end. So one is composite video and the other two are for the audio. So there are actually speakers built into the monitor itself. So when I got the cable, I was finally able to power it on, and I was very much looking forward to this beautiful blue screen with Commodore 64 on it. Unfortunately, these packages are very cheap because they really don't have what is advertised. In my case, it wasn't working. So it did come up with a blue screen and it said Commodore 64, but then it said, please insert a data cassette. Well, I didn't have any data cassettes, and besides that, the machine shouldn't be saying that. So I looked online, and some suggestions were that maybe the run stop key was stuck or the shift lock key. This is a common problem apparently. Or maybe there's a keyboard problem or the ROM might be faulty. So of course you can't get into this machine. It's totally impossible. It has a very high security sticker on here which totally prevents access. It says that if you remove this sticker, the warranty will be void, which sounds very bad, so we won't be doing that. So, of course, when I turned it upside down, I noticed that the machine started working. And, of course, I'd already mashed the keys a lot and switched it on and off many times. So I was very surprised about that. And then it dawned on me, of course, this is an Australian keyboard. It's from down under, and it's only designed to work upside down. Well, all jokes aside, I did realise, of course, that this meant that it was a good candidate for percussive maintenance. And, of course, viewers of this channel will need no introduction to this. It's where you take the device and you accelerate it very rapidly towards the table without slowing it down before it reaches the table. And actually this really fixed the problem in this case, or it seems to have. Now it starts up correctly and I actually get a prompt and I can type and use the disk drive and so on. So there does seem to be a problem. I get some corruption with some of the graphics, and I don't know whether this is just because some of the game files are corrupted or whether there's a problem with the ROM. So it may eventually have to be opened up and repaired anyway, or more likely it's actually the RAM that's corrupted. So the plan of today's video is to take a look at some of the Commodore 64 games and do a bit of a comparison with what would have been available at the same time in the IBM PC. And bear in mind the Commodore 64 came out in 1982, in January 1982, and so this would have been up against the PC. The Commodore was actually more popular than the PC. They were at their height selling 400,000 units a month for some years in a row, and in fact it is, you know, by some reports the most popular single computing unit in history. So of course if we want to know what the Commodore 64 was capable of, or a little bit about how to program it, we should look in the user manual. And unfortunately the user manual only contains basic information, pun intended, about how to program it. And in the back it even says if you really want to seriously program it, you should purchase the Commodore 64 Programmer's Reference Guide from your Commodore dealer. Well, I was in town this morning by coincidence, and but unfortunately my Commodore dealer seems to have packed up shop, so I'm on my own there. But of course these days there's some great information online. So in particular I recommend the Chaos Communications Congress videos, which have been running for many years, and they're usually entitled something like The Ultimate Guide to Blah, where blah is a piece of retro hardware. So these are really informative, and so what I've learned so far is that this was an 8-bit machine based on the 6510 CPU, and it ran at about 1 megahertz. This is compared with an IBM PC, which of course had a 16-bit CPU running at 4.77 megahertz. And so initially you might think that this is a pretty bad comparison. And it turns out that of course the 8088 had an 8-bit external data bus, even though it was internally a 16-bit CPU. And in any case, a bus access would take 4 cycles, so you can, according to some accounts, divide by 4 anyway to get a rough comparison. So in other words, this shouldn't be very far off what an IBM PC can do computationally. It has 64 kilobytes of memory. Of course, early IBM PCs would have had the same, although that rapidly grew in later models. But this machine has some distinct advantages. So in particular in graphics it had the VIC chip, which had raster interrupts and also sprites, which you wouldn't have had in the PC. So this made it particularly suitable for games, and the SID chip for sound was also similarly much more advanced than what you would get out of a PC speaker. So you could offload a lot of the graphics and sound to the specialized hardware. So this made the machine very, very popular, and in particular I'm interested in looking at what was the hardware used for back in the day. In particular, how did people push the envelope, and what kind of innovative uses of that hardware was there for games that went really beyond what was originally envisaged by the manufacturers. Of course, in modern days, a lot more is known due to the demo scene and people reverse engineering the machines and really studying them very carefully about how to optimize code for this particular hardware. But we're interested today in what things were like back in the day when these games were written and how that compares with the equivalent PC stuff of the era. So sit back and enjoy. This is the Commodore 64. So in case you wanted to know how the Commodore 64 starts up, that's it. A couple of seconds, so clearly much faster than a PC. So the first thing I'm going to do here is load the directory, which is $, and this is from 8, which is the number for the drive, and we'll list the directory, and it basically shows the games that were listed on the diskette label. So we're going to load Boulder Dash, and you just type in the name or anything that approximates it, and then it will look for it on the disk. Now notice the star and the O at the top of the screen gone funny colours there. I don't know whether that's just indicating that the very slow disk drive is in action, or whether this is some kind of screen corruption. I suspect the latter. And of course this drive is incredibly slow. Of course it can't be loading more than 64 kilobytes of memory because that's all we have. So yeah, it's a really slow drive. There are apparently cartridges you can get to speed up the diskette loading, but I don't have one of those, so we just have to wait a few seconds until the game comes up. Now that it's up, we just type run, and this is Boulder Dash. So it's a bit of fun trying to work out how to get this to start. I think F1 and a joystick button seems to start it. And then the objective seems to be to run around and get these orb things, but if you go under a boulder and allow it to fall on you, then of course you die. So it seems like the main objective is to collect as many of those glowing orbs as possible and figure out how to get around without the boulders falling on top of you. So I don't think very much is going on here, although you'll notice that there's very smooth scrolling left and right, and of course that has to be hardware supported. But other than that, the game itself seems to be very straightforward. Presumably the rocks moving about and the little guy moving about could be sprites, but I doubt it's actually necessary for this game to use sprites for that, although I could be wrong, of course. So the other thing that's interesting here is, of course, you have colour. In fact, 16 colours are available, and this 32200 is the highest resolution available with this machine. And of course, this is much more than you would have expected on an IBM PC, which would have had a CGA adapter with 4 colours. So it really is an interesting improvement over the PC. But this is Boulder Dash, so let's move on to the next game. So this is actually an original intro to a game that's been added by somebody who has presumably cracked this game. I think that's what's going on here. And so it's always customary to have some kind of fancy graphics effect to show off your skill, and so that's what this is doing here. So there's obviously scrolling going on in the background with a fancy set of letters moving about. Now, I would presume those letters are sprites, although they're quite large. It was possible to double the size of sprites, so they might just be double-sized sprites. Quite how the background is done, I don't know. That could be a more advanced effect. So the graphics for the load screen for Boulder Dash 2 is quite impressive, but once you get into the actual game itself, you're greeted with this familiar brown background. The game mechanics seem to be slightly different. It seems to be possible for these boulders to fall on you even when they're not directly above, and there are additional game elements such as these squares that move about that you have to avoid lest you get killed. So this is the video puzzle game, which doesn't actually work, but this is the crack that's at the beginning of that. So just a little scroll bar at the bottom and a fancy graphic. So this is Pinball, and you can see that the colours are not very impressive, but there's a little ball going about. Now as you notice the ball going over the background there, you can see it looks like it's XOR'd with the background, so this is a hint to me at least that they're perhaps not using sprites for this. On the other hand, they do have to do computation for collision, and so they could possibly be using the collision hardware somehow for this particular game. It's not really clear how they would do that, you know, given that they have to go around corners here and model collision with these flippers that are on the sides here. So they must have some kind of either very clever algorithm to handle this, or they're using the sprite collision hardware in a tricky way. to make this possible. So this is Arkanoid. I think I mispronounced that earlier. Very intrusive music there. J for joystick, and then the game itself is a lot less impressive than the startup graphics here. It's actually just some form of Breakout clone, and you have a little spaceship down the bottom. Now, of course, this is probably just using ordinary sprites. The little spaceship and the missile that you fire from that is almost certainly using ordinary sprite technology. So this is Deceptor. So far I've actually been having a fair bit of trouble getting some of these games to run. It seems to be that there's directories on the disk, but when you try to load anything, nothing actually happens. So I wasn't able to work out how to play Deceptor, but this little demo runs eventually if you leave it long enough. You can see it has very smooth scrolling, and obviously there's a sprite for the little ship that's moving around. But it's very colourful graphics, and I noticed that the graphics at the bottom of the screen seem to stretch out beyond the usual viewable area, which is a trick you could do with this hardware. Now this morphing between the two different ships here is really impressive. So I don't know how that's done at all, because that's clearly not just sprites. I presume that they've just preloaded that little morph sequence into memory, and they're just blitting it very fast into screen memory. Otherwise, everything's probably pretty standard. There is some flashing that goes on every now and again in the border area, but this is all pretty standard fare for the Commodore 64. So yeah, very impressive graphically, not so great in the playability department, unfortunately. So there's a very impressive graphic at the start of this particular game. So a lot of the Commodore 64 graphics could be very impressive if one put a lot of work into aligning the different elements of the graphic with the blocks that were available in the screen. I guess the blocks are about the size of those weirdly coloured blocks in the upper left where we got screen corruption, and there were various tricks for setting the colours within the blocks. But you couldn't go without, you couldn't have more than a certain number of colours in each block. And so in order to get really impressive graphics like that, you had to do rather a lot of work. So this is Championship Wrestling, which is actually animated extremely well. But unfortunately, whenever you die, then the game ends and you have to go back to the title screen, which means flipping the disc and waiting another minute or so. So you get a couple of seconds of gameplay before you have to restart. And of course, it takes a very long time for the disc to load the game again. Well, this one's probably pretty familiar to everybody. This is Pac-Man. I won't show this very long. It's obviously just sprites moving over a background. I only wanted to show it because of its fame. There's not really very much to say about it. So this is Asterisk and the Magic Cauldron. I have no idea what this will be like as a game. Very good music in this. But unfortunately playability is again suffering from the fact that it's totally unclear how to make anything move, and the joystick simply doesn't work here, and I can't find keys that seem to correspond to movements at all. So yeah, presumably this is designed to run with some other piece of hardware I don't have, so on to the next game. So here's a very nice effect. There's a staircase which is presumably done by just updating the lines that need to be updated. And there are of course some little animals moving around. I assume they're sprites, although they're quite large once again. nice fire effect down the bottom of the screen, which presumably is just done with the CPU and alternating various patterns. So I don't really know very much about this game itself. I can actually walk around and climb up this staircase, I assume. I'm not sure why the staircase is moving down towards me. I guess it's some kind of elevator, and my guess is that I have to avoid these creatures that are coming towards me and climb up to the top to go through the door, which I probably have no chance of actually succeeding with. So I'm probably not going to spend a lot of time doing this. And what's the bet? This guy is going to be right in my way when I want to get in. Yes, of course. So yeah, that's a very interesting game, and I think that this you know, shows off a few different techniques that we haven't seen in some of the other games so far. So this particular game probably doesn't need any introduction. I've actually got the music turned off here because it's a quite recognisable soundtrack from the movie, and I don't want to set off any copyright filters, of course. There was also, interestingly enough, some recorded voice at the beginning of this, which quite surprised me because I wasn't expecting the SID chip to be capable of that. But obviously someone figured out how to record voice and play it back. The game itself, once it starts, is a little bit boring. At the beginning at least, there's a lot of text to fill in, and you have to fill your vehicle with items to take out on the hunt. And then as you start into the game, it gets a little bit more interesting. So first of all, you move about some city streets, and of course this is all just done with standard sprites, I'm sure. It's a little bit more interesting once you start driving in the car. This car itself moves back and forth. Now that is quite large to be a sprite, so I don't know how this is actually done. Of course you could scroll the car back and forth, but then you have the problem of moving these lines on the road underneath. Presumably that's the only bit that's really animated here, but I don't know how that's done. So if you have any ideas about that, let me know. Once you get out on location, it's a little bit more straightforward. There are just sprites moving about, and it's actually a very playable game, although I did manage to die by crossing the beams at the very beginning here. But overall, very playable game, and I'm sure it was very enjoyable back in the day. So this game is a game by Jordan Magner, who was also responsible for Prince of Persia, but it seems to be some kind of karate game. I think this is Karate Kart, which I believe was the game he wrote before Prince of Persia. Unfortunately, I don't know how the controls work for this one, and it looks like I've just died. But anyway, that's the end of that one. So I'm going to leave it here for that episode. Obviously, there are vastly more games on these discs than I anticipated, and more than 2/3 of the discs seem to actually be working. I'm going to perhaps come back to this in a later video, but it won't be for some time. I certainly need to learn how to use some of these games. I will say that the experience so far is much more like running a BBC Micro for some of the games. Other ones, of course, are very slick and smooth, especially the ones produced by big production houses, and are much more playable. But overall, it's a very different experience to the PC. Of course, the disk drive being so slow really makes the whole thing a lot more tedious for many of the games. But the music is very impressive in some of them, and of course some of the graphical effects are quite impressive given the limitations of the hardware. So that's it for today. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll be back to our regular scheduled PC content in the next video. If you'd like to see that, then don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in a later video. Bye!